We're looking at this a lot broader today when we talk about diversity and the power of being different. Not that we need any more people in your department that are different, but we'll talk about how what diversity is and what it's not. We'll describe the four worlds of diversity. They say, the experts have their four worlds. We'll state why diversity is useful, and we'll understand the barriers to diversity, the things that keep us from being more diverse in the workplace, and explain the consequences of ignoring diversity. Okay? So a little history. The term diversity was used in the 12th century to mean different, odd, wicked, or perverse. Well, no wonder we have a negative thought towards diversity, right? And certainly it's changed quite a bit. It carried a negative connotation. It meant to single out people who weren't accepted in normal society. But it's been enhanced with changes in workforce demographics, and now it's really turned around that while it still means difference, that it's the differences in people, what makes them different from others, but now we have started to embrace that, right? Rather than say, if you're different, we don't need you. We've really started to take a look at different people can be a positive thing. But it does still continue to be confused with affirmative action, and that's not what we're talking about here. So put that out of your mind, and this will go through, this will sink in a lot easier. Because affirmative action concerns special recruitment and development offers to overcome underrepresentation of minorities in the workplace. When we're talking about diversity here, we're not talking about we don't have anyone of color in our department, so we have to hire someone of color the next time we hire. That's not what we're talking about here. Equal opportunity concerns legal compliance with applicable laws, regulations, and policies to prevent discrimination in employment decisions based on color, creed, national origin. That's discrimination that we're going to get to in the next hour. Not diversity. Okay? That is not diversity. What diversity is it's organizations and people responding to the differences among people who are in the workforce in a way that respects and honors those differences. That's what the diversity that we're discussing today. Recognizing the value of differences between our teammates and our customers, because there is value that we'll talk about in having people have different backgrounds. Understanding how differences have a positive impact on profitability and innovation. And when we talk about profitability, we're talking about getting the work done with the limited amount of resources that the taxpayers are willing to give us, right? So here's 3M's statement on diversity: valuing our uniqueness while respecting our difference, maximizing our individual potentials, and synergizing our collective talents and experiences for the growth and success of 3M. Very big company. The sticky note was a mistake that they made. They made a glue that didn't work right and realized that it would stick over and over again. You know, how many millions of dollars do you think they've made on sticky notes? It's being able to recognize the potential in something that others think is a mistake or a negative that has led 3M to be a huge leader in the world economy. And you see that's Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing is what 3M stands for. I'm a native Minnesotan. I was born and raised there. And I'll tell you, Minnesota is the melting pot. You think of New York or Chicago, but Minnesota, you know, my parents' generation, everyone was Swedish, German, Norwegian. That was it. I mean, Scandinavian countries and Germans was about all there was in Minnesota. Now you go there, and the churches have brought in refugees from literally every nation in really a melting pot. So I think that's what leads 3M to having this statement that they've embraced that their employees are made up of very different backgrounds and cultures and ideas and value systems, and they're making the best of it and see that there's a real positive to doing that. Chevron, we value the uniqueness of individuals and the varied perspectives they provide. We promote diversity within our workforce and have an inclusive environment that enables each of us to fully participate and contribute. Okay. So let's talk about these 4 worlds of diversity. So there's the personal, the interpersonal, so the diversity among ourselves, the diversity of us in comparison to other people, diversity within the organization as a whole, and then diversity in the environment. So let's look at some examples of those. Personal diversity, we're diverse in age, race, ethnicity, gender, physical ability, sexual orientation. Those are the ways that we might be diverse from one another on a personal level. Right? Makes sense? But again, people focus on that and think we're talking about affirmative action. Well, we're talking about much more. We're talking about the interpersonal, which would be our income, our personal interests, our recreational interests, our religion, our education, work experience, appearance, parental status, marital status, just all sorts of things that put us in a group that we belong to, that makes us different from other people in other groups. And then we have the environmental, the economy that we live in, the inflation that's occurring in our environment, the interest rates, foreign events that are going on, national events that are going on, that can make us different if we're, especially if we're working on the global level, from others. And people that come from other countries, you know, here in Utah, we've got a lot of move-ins, right? I'm a move-in, but just from Minnesota. My next door neighbors are from Holland. And they've been working in Utah for 20-some years, but they're still, their home is still Denmark. So, you know, we have diversity there, here in Utah, where there's lots of people from out of the country that are here and working in the workplace in Utah. Maybe not Emory County,
but I'm from Miller County, so see, that tells everybody else. So even
yeah, way out there.
See?
Very diverse. And we have our organizational diversity with the classification of the type of work we do, the work content, the division of the department, what our seniority level is, what you know, what location do we work at, whether we're part of a union or not, and our management status, just how high up in the management ranks are we. All of those things make us different from other people in the workplace. Because if you look at all of these different items, is there any 2 people in your workplace that are the same? No. Even twins. Me. So there is a lot of diversity already in the workplace because of this, right? So it's certainly something we can't ignore, but here's why it's useful. Studies have proven that teams consisting of members with a wide array of values and experiences just simply perform better. When you get one group together that has very similar backgrounds, especially on the issue that they're trying to solve, they don't come up with as good a solution as a group that has varying backgrounds. And that has been studied over and over and over again, generally with the same result. Mixed groups consistently produce better quality solutions. The greater the differences in the perception, the higher quality of problem solving. So the more diverse they are, the even better it gets. And have you ever been in one of those situations where you're trying to work something out and you've got a group of people who, they're not all at the same level of expertise in the area that you're talking about? And because of that, the discussion's just much better. And somebody brings something up that, you know, you may have some experience in the area, and you say, well, that's stupid, and then you start thinking about it, and it's like, wow, why didn't we ever think of that before? Because many times, when you've got a group of people who all think alike, they're also thinking traditionally. They keep thinking and doing the same thing over and over and over again, and don't recognize all the changes that are taking place in the world, in the community, in the workplace, the needs of the customers, any of those things, and all of a sudden, something that would have been a stupid question years ago is a very pertinent question today. And it was only because of that diversity, somebody outside of the box that doesn't know the issue very well, throwing it out there, that you realize, wow, that's a great idea. That's the power of diversity. Conflict arising from opposing viewpoints causes more complete and innovative solutions. So this is one place where we want some conflict. It's not shouting and screaming at each other, but it's disagreement. I don't know how that would fix the problem. Explain to me how that would fix the problem. Having that discussion rather than just, hey, we all know, we've seen this before, and this is the way we've always fixed it before, so we're going to fix it the same way as we always have, right? That doesn't get you a lot of good input. That may not be the best answer. And again, with diversity, because of all of those things, business performance is improved. And we all have to improve in our business because our business is being efficient, constantly doing more with the same or less, right? Big surplus in last year's budget. What are we going to do with it? We're going to increase salaries? We're going to give more? No, we're going to lower taxes. That's just the way it works in government. So we can't expect that we're going to see increases in revenue, but we do need to do, so we need to be more efficient, do things better, faster, stronger, and diversity will help us get there. Workforce growth in U.S. is very low. Immigration into the U.S. will continue to rise. We all continue to see that. They might have to climb a little higher. Sorry, it's probably not perfect. Technical knowledge demand is high in the U.S., but workforce is not available in the U.S. So again, because our own people in the U.S. just can't fill all the technical requirements, technical jobs that are being created in the U.S., we're going to just see that many more people coming in from other countries with very diverse backgrounds than what we've had in the past. 3/5 of the world's college students are from developing countries. So again, we're going to see more and more of them here in Utah, especially as we're becoming more of a tech state. Academic performance of U.S. Continues to decline comparatively with many other nations, not all, but many other. And the workforce continues to age. A lot of baby boomers out there that are in their last stretch, right? And right now, I mean, there are clearly in our state more jobs than there are bodies. I don't know how many of you have tried to hire lately, but it's darn near impossible. I mean, when I hired not about a year ago for a position, now I got several hundred applications for that job, but they all came from Workforce Services. Not a single applicant was qualified for the job. You just get those couple hundred from the state workforce management or Workforce Services. But there were maybe 2 or 3 in all of Salt Lake that were qualified at all for the job. And I had to move quick because, you know, I waited a week before I started calling to get set up interviews. 2 of them were already gone. So again, we're going to have to be pulling people from other places to fill all the positions here in Utah, whether it's from other states or other countries. So, and I think you'll start to see that here, even in the smaller communities. You know, this ROI program that the governor's been supporting, that was a creation of one of the Paiute County commissioners and some of the other commissioners to be able to do more tech in small rural communities. Just give them the links and let people live in a small community like Castledale but be working for a large tech company is happening. And so you'll see more diversity in your community, if not in your workforce. Increase of single parents in the workforce is another thing that we've seen that brings more diversity, right? Increase of elder care issues creates a lot of diversity, and statistic that by 2025, the average U.S. residents will trace their descent to Africa, Asia, the Hispanic area, the Pacific Islands, and Arabia. So the white Northern European male will not be the majority of this country any longer. 75% of women between the ages of 25 and 34 are in the workforce now. And this is a couple years old. I'm sure it's higher already. And you can imagine that wasn't the case one generation ago, right? Not even close. Women in management have increased 24% since 1990. So not only are there more women in the workforce, there's more women in the different areas of the workforce. That adds to diversity. And in 2000, there were 1.1 million interracial marriages in the U.S. compared to only 200,000 in 1960. So we are really becoming a melting pot at the personal level. So a few diversity or barriers to diversity: certainly prejudice, stereotype bars us from thinking positively about diversity, discrimination. And consequences of ignoring diversity really are that racial bias claims cost the American economy $215 billion a year, which is 4% of the GDP. Racial bias claims, lawsuits for racial discrimination, is 4% of our gross domestic product. That's huge. Age discrimination cases are increasing, with the median award of $219,000 per case, and I believe that was a 2016, 2015 number, and all of those are going. The inability to recruit and retain employees if you're not diverse and recognize the potential for diversity, and you're culling out people who are different. We want everybody to fit in, and we'll be able to work together. So we don't want someone who has different values and different background. That's just not going to work in our department. That's going to make it all that much more difficult to find people to put in your positions. And it's going to lead to a lack of innovation and leads to stagnation and collapse, because again, more diverse groups think better, stronger, faster. That was a quick one. All it needs to be. Questions? Okay. So when people say diversity, don't right away think negative. And recognize that, you know, I've come to learn there's no way out of it. I gotta hire those millennials. I'm just gonna have to deal with it and recognize that they do have strengths, and learn to acknowledge that and to embrace it. All right, let's move on to the next quick one, which is employment law. So again, I'm just going to give you the highlights of some of the more important employment-related laws, so that when you run into one of these issues, you will say, Johnny said something about that. I better go down and talk to him, because I'm not sure that I'm going to get myself in trouble with this situation. So we're going to review the pertinent legal issues and employment laws, understand the legal and legislative foundation of human resource policies, we'll start out with classic discrimination. So Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 makes it unlawful for an employer to discriminate against any individual with respect to their compensation, their terms of employment, their conditions or privileges of employment. You can't treat people differently in any of those ways based on their race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. That's what Title VII says. And we all know that, right? Anybody that comes as a surprise to, we've been living with it for quite a while. That is classic discrimination.
So that means you can discriminate against a white male then? Is that right?
Well, no.
I mean, since I've never understood that term, discrimination is discrimination.
Yeah.
I don't understand why we call out different.
Right, and
So it just seems kind of odd.
And there's many that think that believe that affirmative action, what you're talking about, by saying you have to hire people that are minority, is that not discriminating against people who are not minority? Should we look at everyone equally? If we're going to give preference to someone who is a minority, we are discriminating against the majority. But that's the way that the Congress felt we needed to do it, to push diversity, affirmative action, to push diversity into the workplace. Hopefully we're getting to that point in time where we don't need that type of push by the government to embrace diversity any longer. What Title VII does is it covers private and public sector employees or employers who have 15 or more employees. It prohibits discrimination based on the protected classes. It's enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, and you have both private litigation, so you can be usually what you see as far as penalties for having violated it is private litigation, where you're going to be in a jury trial and you're going to have to compensate that person for discriminating against them and pay punitive damages. Now, as a government entity, we don't pay punitive damages. The courts don't teach taxpayers a lesson by making them pay punitive damages, but certainly in a lot of the really big cases that you've heard about, the majority of the judgment against those employers was punitive damages. The compensation, they pay back wages, they pay some amount for the mental stress that it put on that person and things, but the majority of what they end up with is we're teaching that company a lesson that they're never doing this again. We're doing that by hitting them in the wallet. So that's Title VII. We expanded Title VII and also said you also can't discriminate against people with disabilities when we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. That prohibits discrimination against a qualified individual with disabilities who are able to perform the essential duties or functions of a job with or without accommodation. And we've all heard that term from Mary, right? You have to make reasonable accommodation, and you need to make sure, the question is, can you perform the essential functions of the job with or without accommodation? We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the hiring process. Disability is an impairment, chronic or acute, which substantially limits a major life activity. Wow, that's very, very broad, isn't it? So that's one to be aware of. If you are dealing with an employee who has a new disability, and you are going to be taking adverse action against them, or you feel like because of their new disability, they're not doing their job, and you're going to take some disciplinary action after them, something to talk to them about. Make sure that what you're asking them to do or what you plan to take disciplinary action against them on is something that's not an essential function, or it's an essential function that you haven't even discussed reasonable accommodation, because you have to do those things. Okay?
Does addiction, is that an Is that a defined disability? Addiction?
There are qualifiers around addiction. If they've been through a treatment program and successfully finished the treatment program, then they're qualified. If they're addicted and not treatment, I think I'm still right. Yeah, that's not a qualifier. So as soon as they enter treatment, you might have to now start making accommodation. Okay?
How are you guys?
So then we had the Equal Pay Act, and we're taking these in chronological order, in 1963, which then covers private and public sector employers for Federal Labor Standards Act exemption and non-exempt personnel, and it prohibits unequal pay due to gender for work requiring equal skill, effort, and responsibility under similar working conditions. The male makes $20,000 a year, and female co-employee does the exact same job, been in the job the same amount of time, earns $15,000, got a problem here. Then we have the Age Discrimination Act, which came along, and that prohibits private employers having 20 or more employees from discriminating against their employees and job applicants who are at least 40 years of age. So you can't say, wow, we really are looking for somebody who's going to be around for a while. You can't do that. If the most qualified candidate is 60, you hire them, or you're violating the statute.
Are we considered a private?
What's that?
Are we considered a private employer?
You're government, so all of these apply to you. Yeah. Immigration Reform and Control Act is one you'll run into in the hiring process. And that it was intended to eliminate the employment of illegal aliens, and it uses the I-9 form to show that to give the proof of identity and proof of residency as a U.S. citizen, or that they have a visa or something of the like at the time of employment. And again, that's a process at the hire that you want to make sure that you've got that proof provided to you, especially as heated as an issue as that is right now. You want to make sure that you've done that. Fair Labor Standards Act sets minimum wage, the requirements for overtime pay, equal pay, record keeping, and child labor laws for workers who are covered by and not exempt from the act. So again, it's very small employers are exempt from this, but as a government employer, you are not exempt from it. So you need to follow all the overtime rules and requirements. If you know that you've got people that are putting in more than 40 hours a week and you are not compensating them with overtime and you think it's no big deal, believe me, I've been there when they come back 10 years later with their yellow legal pad of every overtime hour that they worked during their career, and you owe it to them. So manage that. Yeah, it requires the time and a half for any hours over 40 hours a week, if they're not exempt. And exempt status is very clearly defined. Just because you pay them a salary doesn't make them exempt. They have to meet the requirements of that they have some supervisory responsibilities or making significant decision making, that they have authority to make significant decisions and things of that sort. So,
If the overtime isn't approved though, how can they come back? I mean, if I choose to work 10 hours extra a week and they tell me not to, but I did anyway, then I get to come back 10 years, you get maybe time and a half.
They can't tell you to work more.
That's what I'm saying, they didn't tell me. I chose to.
Well, that would be your defense in court. We didn't ask them to work those extra hours. And so, as far as we're concerned, they were volunteering, which you can't volunteer unless it's approved as a government volunteer. So that would be your defense. But if the supervisor knows that they're doing that, I'm not telling you you got to work 10 hours, 3 days a week. Not telling you you have to, but they know they are, and they know that's the only way they're getting their work done, you're gonna pay. Even though it's not been approved in the budget. All right.
But if you tell them not to work it, they work it the next day.
I would tell them not to work it and tell them not to show up.
But then that's a disciplinary action too. You know, if you're telling them no overtime and they're working overtime, there's a problem.
What we've done is we actually pay them, but we have to take it's a personnel policy violation. So then we have to deal with it on that end. But we pay, but you get disciplined.
30 days in electric chair.
Yes, that's true if you're a wild child.
Family Medical Leave Act. Employees with at least 1 year of service who have worked at least 1,250 hours in the last 12 months are eligible for Family Medical Leave Act. There's also limitations on how big the employer is. This is one that with 5 employees, I'm not subject to it, but you guys are, right? Yeah. Eligible employees may take up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave for birth or adoption of a child, serious illness of the employee, a spouse, a dependent child, or a parent, or to assist a dependent called to a qualifying exigency. Okay. So if a dependent has a serious illness or injury, they have to take off to take care of them. They're allowed up to 12 months, 12 weeks of leave, and they might get an additional 26 weeks to care for a dependent, injured, or ill if they're a serviceman, military serviceman. Okay.
So that is only dependents, I mean, they spend on your taxes, not your adult children per se.
Right. They don't have to be your children, but if they are dependent. Dependent could actually be, yeah. May also include an aunt, uncle, grandparent, next of kin, significant person who plays the role of a parent. So it's pretty broad. And what this does is, it's not paid leave.
But it can, but policy can dictate that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can if you want, but what the law requires you to do is you have to have a job, similar position open for them when they get back. That's what you need to do.
But not necessarily the same job.
The law says same or similar.
Similar.
Right. So you will pay similar type of work, right? Things of that sort. They can't come back and you tell them, well, we had to hire a new supervisor, so you're going to go back to the bottom rung on the ladder, and your pay is half of what it was. Then no, that doesn't meet the law. So it does make it difficult, right? Sometimes. And the 12 weeks doesn't have to be continuous. They can take 3 weeks off, be back for 2, take another 4 weeks off, be back for 6, take another 2. So you need to track that and make sure you're working with Mary on tracking that leave, so that especially when it's not continuous like that.
Unless it's the birth of a child, then it is continuous.
So again, you can see there's all kinds of exceptions, limitations, things of that sort. Again, the important part is you have an employee that is injured, or you know that a family member or dependent of theirs is, and they start having missing work from it. Sit down with Mary, make sure that you're covering this base. We're going to keep you busy too, Mike. So, quick list of some other employment laws to be aware of. Pregnancy Discrimination Act. Wow, we need this person and we need them full-time right now, and here's this candidate sitting across the table from me, ready to drop. Good reason to hire the second best person? Not a chance. You gotta hire her. Can't discriminate because she's pregnant. Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA. regulates the asking for and providing health information, medical information. So be careful if you're asking for, you know, if you're going to take off for 2 weeks, I'm going to need medical reports from your doctor to make sure that there's some real issues with that. So again, if you're anything that you're touching health information, make sure that you're talking with Mary about. Employment, Retirement and Income Security Act. When you have issues with retirement, again, a whole slew of laws there that you want to make sure that you're checking in and don't be guessing at it. COBRA, which allows for employees that leave work to be able to pay for their own health insurance, to continue to be on the county's health insurance program at their own cost. 18 months. So make sure that you're following through and making sure that they're aware of that option for them. OSHA Act, we're a state, OSHA state, so we need to make sure we're complying with all the occupational safety and health requirements there. If an OSHA inspector shows up at your door, who do they contact in Henry County? You? Yeah, because you want to have a procedure for that to limit just how extensive and problematic that might become for the counties. So we have the federal and state safety acts there. And then the Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act, or USERRA. Anytime you have military service personnel that need to leave for active service or are coming back from active service, there's a whole slew of requirements there as far as how you must keep the job open, how soon you can ask them to be back at work, when they have to be back at work, all of those sorts of things. So again, don't guess, get in touch with the expert. And then we have a few state employment laws, the workers' compensation laws, under which the employer gives up any defenses that the employee was responsible for part of the injury. You know, we all have that question, right? We've all had a worker that was injured on the job, right? And you wonder, why are we going to pay for that? He's just stupid. But that's what we gave up. We don't get to say the employee was stupid, they were violating a safety policy, and in return, we only have to pay the benefits that the Workers' Compensation Act outlines, and they can't sue you. Can't bring a lawsuit against you for their injury. So that's a give and take law that was created back in the 30s, and we continue to wrestle with. And then the Utah Volunteer Government Workers Act. Volunteers to government agencies are considered employees for both liability and workers' compensation with some limitations. So how many have volunteers in your departments? If you don't know this act really well, get up to speed on it. It prohibits anyone from volunteering service to a governmental agency that has not been authorized to be a volunteer. Prohibits them from. They're trespassing if they show up and volunteer and they haven't been approved. And the approval process is Mary, as the HR person, has to approve them, and the commission has to approve them. Both have to approve that volunteer, or they can't be providing service.
Do you have any knowledge of community service hours that the courts are ordering to make do that for government agencies? Community service hours.
Yeah.
Violations.
Well, if it's part of, they talk about compensatory service workers in this act, where if they're doing that volunteer service as a part of their parole or their incarceration or their sentence that they've had, they're treated differently. But they are treated, they're referred to in this statute. So if you are dealing with those types of people, you'll want to refer to this statute as well. So what it does is, any volunteer that you've authorized, they hurt someone, they damage someone's property, the county is just as responsible for their actions as they are for any other employee. And use of a vehicle. just as responsible for them as they are a regular employee. On the workers' compensation side, they injure themselves while they're volunteering. Workers' comp pays their medical benefits. They don't get paid for any lost time that they might have from their regular job, but they do get their medical benefits paid by the county's workers' comp, which can increase the cost for the county, right?
So we do use limited volunteers, but we're under the impression, or the rule is, as long as the librarian or staff are doing over 50% of the work, like if they want to come in and read a story or something at story time, a parent, or if they're doing some sort of Sterling Scholar program and they come and help us, I thought there was this over 50% rule in that, which not that you're aware of. So every volunteer, whether they're high school mothers wanting to help, need to go through
If
that.
they're volunteering service that is a benefit to the county, yes. Now, in a reading program, if it's a program, and there's another entity out there, that what
So
I'd
what would
suggest
be-
is they should be a volunteer to that entity that has the reading program.
Well, it would be the library. The library has a reading program per se, and we have so-and-so come and help and maybe do puppet play or something. That's, you know, but the library's still, you know, overseeing that.
If the library decides that that's a benefit to the constituents, and so it's a benefit to the county to have that service provided by a volunteer, you've created that liability now for the county.
But Sterling Scholars, you can push that back on the high school.
Oh, okay, so there are some.
Yes.
Some-
If it's students, particularly interns, that sort of thing, that some of you might have to deal with, they're doing that not so much to provide a service to the county as it is, they have to do that to get their credentials from school.
Mhm.
So that's where you would have an agreement with the school, the university, whoever it is, that you are responsible for your interns. We'll let them come in and work on our premises, but you're responsible for them.
Well, and you know, honor society kids sometimes have to do so much
10 hours.
community service. Okay, but so do they still need to go through the volunteer process, and even though that would go through the school, or, you know, we still would go through the whole process of that?
Yeah, I mean, the school is telling them go on and get some community service
Yeah.
hours to graduate. They can choose to do that or not. So they're to do that, they want to volunteer and provide some time to you, but it's not over the oversight of the school. There's no, is it an obligation? Kind of, but yeah, I'd say you still would want them to be approved and an authorized volunteer. Because here's what it does. Yes, now you're responsible for them if they injure someone or damage someone's property, and you're going to pay if they get injured. But we have all kinds of immunities as a governmental agency to lawsuits, and we have limitations on how much someone can sue us for. And so rather than having that volunteer get injured and sue you for however much they dream up they need to pay for their injury, they get the workers' compensation medical benefits, that's it. If they injure somebody else and that person sues the county and that volunteer that injured them, well, that volunteer, for the purposes of that liability lawsuit, is a county employee. They're dismissed from the lawsuit right away. The claim continues against the county, and we use the immunities. They pretty much have to show that that person injured them willfully and wantonly for them to actually get it. So there's some real pros and cons. From the volunteer standpoint, they want to be approved and authorized to be a volunteer of the county because now they get all those protections that they don't get with being a volunteer to any other group.
I do just have one more question. So we do have situations where maybe a person will just come and do something out of the kindness of their heart. So they come and do our sidewalks for when there's doing snow removal or whatever. You know, they weren't actually asked or solicited, but here they are, they're showing up, you know, they just saw that we needed some help, and then here they are doing that. What do you do in that situation?
if it leads to a claim, what you gotta tell them is, you were trespassing.
We downright just have to say, we didn't ask you to come, and
Because that's
Okay.
that's part of the reason behind the Volunteer Government Workers Act, is it says a person shall not provide volunteer service to a governmental agency unless they've been authorized. Because the legislature doesn't want the taxpayer to pay for that person who just showed up and did something that they thought the county needed. They want the county to be aware that they've accepted that that person's gonna provide the service to them, or else they're on their own.
And they get approved for a specific thing. It's not like they're approved as a volunteer to do whatever they want to do in the county, because we can't control that. So it's like, okay, they volunteer for the fair, or they volunteer for search and rescue, so that if something happens in that scope, they're covered. Otherwise, they weren't approved.
So all my league coaches are all approved. This is how I ask them to coach, basically. Is that the same?
Well, whatever your approval process is at the rec district, they would need to be approved to be a coach.
But the rec district is a governmental agency, and whoever is identified as the HR representative for the district has to approve them, and the chair of the board. It has to be two people. The chair of the governing body, or the executive of the agency, and the HR person.
Is there an exigent circumstance clause to this? We just dealt with this on that avalanche. We called in a team to come in with their dogs, and when they showed up there, that's what they told me. They said, I have to run under yours. And I said, well, this is our process. And I said,
That's why, has the commission given you authority to give their approval? Many counties do that, because Mary can't delegate hers as the HR function, but in the statute, the governing body can delegate it. So many will say, okay, for the sheriff, we're gonna delegate our authority to approve volunteers to the sheriff. So all the sheriff has to do is get in touch with the HR director, they're approved. Some county fairs will do the same thing. Fair director and the HR director. So if you're in that situation that you have immediate need for volunteers, that you wouldn't have time to track down the commission to get those people authorized, that would be the discussion to have with the commission is, can you delegate that authority to the department head? And then we'll touch base with Mary to do that. Okay. So you can see there's a whole bunch of issues there with volunteers too that we want to make sure that we're covering. Any other laws you've heard of?
what about genetic testing?
That'd be a HIPAA.
Oh, is that a HIPAA? I've heard just some things about genetics and being discriminated against, and so I can't
You
even
can't
remember
require
what.
genetic testing and then discriminate against them based upon what you find out. So,
So they're more cancer.
Of course, back there.
Someone's a county employee, but then they volunteer for a county fair. Is that still volunteer approval, or are they already kind of there?
Here's the trick there. If they work at the fairgrounds and the volunteer work that they're doing is same or similar work to what they do for the county, that doesn't work.
And you gotta pay them.
Right, that's overtime. So you can't get rid of your overtime obligation by saying, okay, you're done at 5, but then if you want to volunteer from 5 to 8, you're a volunteer, you can't do that.
Let me ask specifically. I do the concert for the county at the aquatic center.
I work at the
She works at the aquatic center, but by her wishes, she helps. She sings the national anthem a lot of times, but helps with the merch, the artist merchandising thing, and just things. You know, some take tickets. Mary takes tickets.
Yes. As long as you're doing things in that volunteer role that are different from your normal day job, then you're a volunteer, and you get the volunteer protections
Okay,
when you're doing
but
that.
then, does that need to be approved by the commission?
Yes, any volunteer needs to be approved by the commission and mayor, or the commission's delegate and mayor.
Is there a timeline on volunteers? Like, if they've been approved, are they approved forever and a day, or?
Statute doesn't say, it just says that you need to authorize them. That's policy. And most of the counties, like here, they specify what service it is that they're approved or authorized to provide to the county and for how long. So that you don't have that problem of, well, yeah, they were a volunteer at the library, but now they haven't been doing that for a couple of years, but now they show up and are shoveling the walks around the courthouse, that they weren't approved. So if the county wouldn't approve them for a specific service, for a specific time, you might be stuck with them injuring themselves shoveling the walk, even though you didn't ask them to, you didn't want them to. Okay. All right. All right, so we talked about Title VII, but let's get through, actually let's take 5. And then we're gonna hit discrimination and harassment.
You know, I just have never understood discriminating against anybody.
Well, what do you want the best person for your job number?
Yeah.
The best person on the
They're green, orange, purple, white, male, female, whatever.
Why are there things because like the religion clause, that they make you work on Sunday? I mean, that's that big $2 million settlement, they make you work over when you work at a place that you require to work. So why do you do this? We don't have that in our library. It's one of the police. So I want to say, your job is
Specify that, yeah.
So now, this last time we were back, a white man.
A white male.
Yeah, we female, we're covered.
Well, that's easy to say. Well, I'm special.
You gotta follow yourself. We need to call Susie and say, hey, she's at our door. But we do just let them know.
Finally, the city council member got his own report. That was after the third social
Well, all of my family has been sure I talked to about, they said that there would be somebody to over there, and they don't shovel my back. Then I've got water people that come and shovel water on Fridays when we're not working, and they let the water run, and so I've got like ice in the ring. So it gets these, and it's kind of so last week they shoveled my we just got done in our carpet thing.
Oh, that's why I haven't.
Yeah, well, I haven't seen him since the carpet thing, but last day that I had volunteers there. He's from the McKenna's boys. They were so good.
What he wants.
I was already, I could tell you the windows. Here's the kid. It was very, and, but I think that he's very,
You've got to consider that white they talk about black general manager, black owners, black everything.
they got it worked on, they moved my shelves back. My shelves were, they got my computer set up, but they got
I mean, what?